Hello, and welcome to episode 71 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
How are you, my man?
I'm doing well today. Feeling good.
Feeling good, Lewis.
LSAT week's almost over, and that leaves me in an optimistic mood. How about you?
I am fantastic, actually, which is way more enthusiastic than I typically would respond. And that is for one reason only. The Masters started today. My beloved Masters golf tournament.
Your hometown golf tournament.
Our single point of pride.
Too.
Yeah.
I was a former Augusta resident. Glad not to be an Augusta resident now. All those who live there or have lived there in the past understand that reference.
Yeah, the weird thing is you did it by choice. I just happened to be born there. I didn't get a say in the matter.
Choice, okay. There were reasons.
You were a grown-up and moved to it.
Yeah.
I was an adolescent fled. But yeah, Masters started today, so I'm very excited to watch that. But this obviously takes priority, as you say. It's the end of test week, the biggest test week of the year. In fact, the November 2020 LSAT-Flex, which is what's on the docket for today.
It's also the end of the test year, in the sense that 2020, as far as LSATs, is over when this week ends, and the next test will be in January.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, calendar year, not LSAT's test year. LSAC's test year, which is weirdly wraps up in May.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of their calendar year, but I do understand it because it relates to the admissions cycle.
That's right.
But either way, let's get to that in a moment. Since it's the daytime, John, a rare daytime episode for us, instead of drinking what I would like to be drinking, which is some kind of like fruity concoction, what are you drinking?
Okay. Yeah, I think your answer is going to be slightly more boring than mine, despite the fact that it's still AM. I did take a master's cue here. I poured myself an Arnold Palmer, but my version of it, because I had neither sweet tea nor lemonade, as you can guess. So I made some green tea and squeezed some lemon in it, and then a splash of vodka. Don't judge me.
It sounds terrible.
It's day one of the Masters. Don't judge me.
Well, I'm drinking water, so it's certainly far more boring. But
I'll judge you.
You go ahead and judge me. I'm okay with that. I accept your judgment and welcome it. You can't touch me.
Fair enough. What about music? You picked the song for today. I think this is I say band, but it's really more artist.
No, it is an artist. It is, she goes by the name of St. Vincent. Her actual name is Annie Clark. So she has a band around her, but she's the primary motivator on this. And the song is Digital Witness. And we kind of chose that because, it's the last flex of the year. We witnessed it, and it was digital, so it kind of all comes together. But if you're not familiar with her, she's a really interesting artist, really good guitarist, a little quirky, but I like that, so I don't have a problem with that. She's got several songs that I think are really good, Los Ageless being one. But I like Digital Witness, too, and I think it fit for this podcast a little bit better than some of her others.
Yeah, I like it. In fact, I don't think I was familiar with her until you had mentioned her, and I saw her was it Saturday Night Live that she played?
Yeah. She did a great performance on Saturday Night Live and just shredded on guitar.
Her live performance was stellar. I was very impressed.
Yeah, she's solid.
You're still the bigger fan here, I think, but that's more familiarity than actual fandom proper. I like her, so good choice.
Most of your musical tastes, predate like 1980. So
this is true. Or at least there's a weird window of time that I hopscotch. I love classic rock and then grunge.
Well, 90s rock is hard not to like.
Yeah, so I go Zeppelin to Soundgarden, basically.
But I mean, there's a direct line between those two eras. Obviously, one ultimately begat the other. You just got all this day glow and neon spandex of the 80s with synthesizers in the middle. So the pendulum swings back and forth.
Yeah. Well, much like Augusta, I don't miss it.
Just parts of it.
There you go. Let's talk a little bit about what's been going on more broadly, because there's a few updates since the last time we got together.
Indeed. Obviously, the LSAT's been going on this week. That's going to be the main focus of our discussion because we're going to review what we saw on the November 2020 LSAT Flex. Let's talk about some things that have been happening, things that are upcoming. First off, a couple of events that are coming up that I just want to mention. I'm doing a free webinar It's going to be live online on Tuesday, November 17th. That will be about the secrets of the law school admissions process. Jon, I think you'll probably be there as well.
That's the plan at the moment. We'll see. But I was looking over some of the content for that this morning just to give a plug. And man, every slide I clicked through had something of just immense value in it. So a very, very cool set of talking points that you'll be able to cover there. No pressure.
Yeah, and Jay Donnell will be there as well. And he and I did an admissions webinar a few weeks ago. And part of what happened in that, I had so much fun doing it. And there was so much more that I wanted to talk about that I thought was really interesting. That's why we created this particular webinar. So if you're in the midst of applying to law school, I think it'd be useful to listen to because there are some things that might help you shape and refine your application. And as we know, especially in a cycle that's looking to be more competitive, every little bit makes a difference.
Another
And
speaking of things you've participated in.
Yeah, the reason my voice might be a little bit raw today is that I've already done one podcast this morning. Moving from one to the other. It's like dating multiple girls, not necessarily the best idea. But Mike Spivey and I of Spivey Consulting did a podcast this morning that will be out tomorrow where we talk about both the admissions process and the LSAT, and we just ask each other various questions that students ask us frequently. So look for that as well. He talked about some really cool things, I thought, in terms of admissions, from applying early to early decision to interviews to the wait lists and so forth. I thought there was a lot of really interesting topics that we covered. So if you get a chance, listen to that. That'll be on their channel, not on our channel.
Which I'm sure we can link to in the notes here. That guy is just a deep well of admissions knowledge. It's almost endless, the things he knows. So.
Yeah, he's one of those people you listen to. He throws off stuff constantly, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And a lot of the stuff I'm familiar with because I know the admissions process really well, but every once in a while he'll start talking about some specific case scenario, and you're like, didn't know that, which is always a cool thing to be in the presence of someone who knows a lot that you don't about something interesting.
Yeah. I learn something every time I have a conversation or watch that guy have a conversation. So Spivey's the man.
Yeah. What else is going on?
Let's shift a little closer to the November test itself, not to the content yet, but there are a few points of interest surrounding it. One of which, and man, do we feel like broken records, is the LSAT Writing. Another test where if you do not have a writing essay sample on file approved in your system, they will not release your score. And the numbers here are once again pretty dismaying. They're staggeringly worrisome. As of yesterday maybe? There were still over 12,000 people for November who had not yet started their LSAT writing.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that LSAC has said to me is, if you want to get your score back in time, you really need to take it this week. So keep that in mind. Get in there and take it if, getting your score on the release date is critical to you. So I think that release date is November 24th?
24th, yeah.
They're saying that if you try to take this next week, you probably won't get your score in time. Now, they shared some other good news, though, which was that initially the LSAT writing flag sessions had been over 50%. Then it dropped to 30%. Right now, it is driving at about a 15 to 20% clip on the total, which is still a lot when you start thinking about thousands of sessions, but it's certainly come down from where it had been previously. And the thing that I will just remind everybody, probably for the nth time here, is if you want to avoid being flagged, do the following things at least. Show both sides of your scratch paper. Don't wear a smartwatch. Have a clear photo of yourself and your ID. And don't have a cell phone or anything else that's unallowed, like a backpack sitting around.
Right.
All those things will get you flagged. Don't get up and leave. Don't talk to other people. If you do those things, your chances of being flagged are very, very low.
Yeah, I can't tell if the percentage has dropped so much due to them maybe loosening their standards or to people simply behaving better or some combination of both. But I will say, I think it's probably a little A and B. I will say if you do this the right way, you'll sail through. You'll be fine. But there are immediate things that cause problems, as you just pointed out. So get that done if you haven't before. It's really not hard. It's a half hour or so of your time.
And you can get approved really quickly. I had somebody send me a picture this morning showing that they were approved and they didn't take it that long ago. So get in there, get it done, and just be done with it, to be honest with you.
Yeah. You mentioned the score release date for this test of the 24th. I like the timing of that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's coming up pretty soon. We got about 12 days or so. But number two, it gives you a little over a week between getting your score if you took this November test and didn't cancel, and the opportunity to register for the January 16th, 17th LSAT. The registration date for that is December 2nd, so a little over a week after the scores come out. That little window of time is hugely important for people because they can make an informed decision as to whether they need to take it again.
Yeah, you get your score. Hopefully you celebrate over Thanksgiving and you don't have to retake it. But if you do, or if you're on the borderline or you know immediately you're going to retake it, you've got a little bit of window there to think about it. Think about which day you want to take it in January, and then to make a move when the window opens.
Yeah, we've talked about that January test in terms of just we did this in the webinar where we were doing our little crystal ball thing last week, which feels like a month ago. This year's been a long week, or this week's been a long year. I can't tell which.
Yeah.
But we were talking about the January test, and just to advocate for it one final time. If you're on the fence, as you say, and particularly if you feel like it would help you to negotiate scholarships and financial aid, that January test can be a godsend. A couple more points in January can translate into tens of thousands of additional dollars from a school. So consider it. Even if you've got a number to get you in November, you might have a number in January that gets you in for less. That's very important.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, Spivey and I just talked about this very question about applying early, versus applying later, how it figures with your score. And he was, I thought, fairly emphatic. He's like, look, they're not worried about the time that you apply. If you're getting in, you're getting in. If you're borderline, you probably want to delay it until you have a better LSAT score on record. So he was pretty clear, in my opinion, about saying, don't worry about when you apply. Just make sure that you apply as in as good a position as you possibly can. And he articulated that, I think, a little bit more broadly than I just did there. So the point is the same, however, which is, hey, don't worry so much about the date that you apply. Worry about putting your best foot forward right out of the gate. And if that means retaking the LSAT, I know that's terrible because you have to waste another 2 months and you got to worry about it over the holidays. But it can be really lucrative to come in with that higher score, and it can get you into different schools than you would have otherwise.
Yeah, I know people hear us say this a lot, that your credentials ultimately contribute more to your attractiveness than the calendar does. But it can't be overstated. Get a higher score, even if it means it delays you a little bit. In this case, maybe about 2 months.
I used an analogy on the podcast that I did with him earlier. I'll just repeat it here. I was like, look, applying early but then not having everything in order is like showing up to a date like an hour early, where you're like, hey, I'm early, I'm really eager, but I'm not, my hair's not combed, I didn't take a shower, maybe my socks are mismatched. Right. It's not really the best look. In fact, it's a really weird look, and you're going to kind of get probably dismissed there. However, if you show up on time and everything's in order, you're dressed well, you've taken a shower, all those kinds of good things, your chances of success are much higher. And that's kind of the same thing here. Applying early just for the sake of it isn't all of a sudden going to help you, get where you want to be. Apply when you are ready and everything is as good as possible. So
yeah,
keep that in mind.
5 minutes late but immaculate. That's what I tend to aim for, but it's usually 15 minutes late.
5 minutes late.
I know.
That's the funniest thing I've ever heard.
It's an LA 5.
I'm often late by an hour. I'm the one that's on time for these kinds of things. We'd always be sitting around like, when's Jon going to join us? Be like, we'll see him in an hour.
Fair.
You're notoriously a late arriver.
Absolutely delinquent. Sorry.
5 minutes.
I won't even try to defend myself.
You can't. I have more evidence than you can imagine that counters that. Let's move on to the November LSAT, which was, of course, administered on time. Actually, it was administered early because originally they said it was going to start on November 14th. That's right. And then they moved this test up a week, which annoyed a number of people, understandably. I'll remind everybody that the reason they moved it early was because they felt that the November 14th date was conflicting with a number of schools' midterms. And they had schools asking them to move it earlier, apparently. So they moved it up from November 14th to November 7th.
Yeah, unlike me, this got here earlier than we expected. And I think to people's benefits, I know it threw a couple people's schedule off, or some people's schedules off. They've taken time off work or arranged, childcare or something. But for the most part, getting this done earlier was, I think, a positive. The release date, again, the 24th, so that's coming up. Let's talk a little bit about the numbers for this test. I alluded to the fact that this was the biggest test administration of the year, certainly the biggest flex that we've seen.
Is it?
Yeah.
I thought one of them was. Am I wrong about? They run together so much that after a while, I'm like, wait, which one was which? But either way, let's talk about the overall numbers. How many people did they see take the test over the 4 days here?
Sure. Yeah, I think there were just shy of about 28,000 people who had registered for this test, which again, if memory serves, and it sometimes doesn't, I think that's the largest number so far. It's certainly right up there. We can run through the days. What surprised me most about the days wasn't so much the numbers themselves, because we knew that a little bit in advance, but the distribution. I was a little surprised that Saturday and Sunday were smaller days. The weekend days were smaller than the weekdays. So Saturday, they had about 5,700 people expected. I think about 5,400 showed up and actually took that day. And again, that's a pretty typical attrition rate, about 10%. Sunday was even smaller, 4,800 or so expected. Monday, bless it, was a day off of testing. Not a day off so much for you and for me, but there were no tests given on Monday. Tuesday was about 7,000. This was weird. 7,500 people somehow took it. So I wonder if that's people who maybe originally planned for the weekend and moved it back. I know I had 2 students of mine do that.
Yeah. I think that's what happens. They move the numbers around because people are like, I can't do it, or I've got a problem. There were storms in some parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So you had 7,500 actually test on Tuesday. And then Wednesday was the biggest day with, around 10,000 people registered. So this is interesting because the weekend was relatively light, less than 6,000. And then Tuesday and Wednesday were over 7,000. And sometimes up to 10,000 in terms of that. And I think we saw the stress of that on the system. We saw some issues on Saturday and Sunday, but Tuesday and Wednesday, I'll be blunt about it, they were not great test days in terms of like overall execution. And I know that from talking to people at LSAC, they weren't seeing any kind of pattern or cause to this, but I was getting a steady stream of people having problems getting the test started, or what I consider to be far worse, getting kicked out of a section somewhere in the middle and just the whole program closes out.
Yeah, like a pure disconnect.
Yeah, and so that was really frustrating. And I think, the note I made was like, Ice Cube had that phrase where it's like, today was a good day. Tuesday and Wednesday, today was a bad day.
They were bad days. Yeah, you said you'd be blunt. I think you were also being diplomatic. They were really, really mismanaged. And I don't know where to point the finger exactly, but fingers deserve to be pointed here.
Well, those experiences are being managed by Proctor U, and I continue to think that the server bandwidth that they have is insufficient to handle what is going on with the live observation and the recording and the delivery of the test. I mean, I've got people who are sitting there on like top-level law firm internet connections, and they lose connection during the test, and it says, your signal's unstable. I'm like, no, it's not.
No, it's not.
That's just not something that I consider to be valid. And I see too many comments from people who are sitting there talking to Proctor U, and they screenshot it or do whatever, who send it to me, and I'm seeing misinformation. Oh, this was an LSAC issue. I'm like, it's your system, friends. You're the ones that are actually delivering the test. Pointing fingers at the other party seems like a convenient way out. And so I wonder about Proctor U in terms of their ability to handle some of this. And let's be honest, there were many, many more people taking it on Tuesday and Wednesday, and we expect to see more complaints. Even if you only have a 1% issue, you're going to see a lot more complaints, almost double the number of test takers from Sunday to Wednesday. So you're going to expect to see more. But I saw way too many. It's an unacceptable level of problems. And I have way too many students messaging me privately saying, I'm in tears right now. I had 8 minutes left in reading comprehension. I got kicked out. They can't get me back to where I need to be. Or they say the time has run out. Your test has been submitted. I'm not willing to accept that in November. Now, is there a way to fix that? Partially. It's not a complete fix, because a complete fix would be to return that person right to where they were and have them finish the test. And that doesn't seem to happen frequently enough.
Right.
The fix is this. They will give you a retest later on in the week if there was a catastrophic problem. Okay, this is a known fact. They've done it every single time. I don't feel uncomfortable talking about it because I have seen it referenced publicly so frequently that I think it's known. On this Friday, there will be people retesting who are able to take another flex test. The key thing is this, is not everybody gets it. If you didn't like your test, you can't call them up and say, I want to retest.
Right.
If you lost 15 seconds due to a kind of like a waiver or the proctor coming through, you're not going to get it. It's going to have to be something that would be considered catastrophic. Your test just disappeared. You could never get started on the test. Halfway through, the whole program closed down. You never got a chance to get back in. You lost 20 minutes in a section. Those things are all catastrophic. Those would qualify you for a retest. So you can ask for it. I will add something, though, that has been driving me insane, and it is happening so often with students who are writing me with problems that I just feel obligated to mention it. Way too often, people will call LSAC and say, I've just been closed out of my test. I lost my last section. You know, they're freaking out, understandably. And the person at the end of the LSAC phone number will say, we're really sorry. You've seen the test now. You can't take it until January, but we'll give you a waiver for that. I've said it several times on prior podcasts. I'm going to say it again. Fix the problem. All right, that is false. You have multiple versions of the Flex. You can give another version to those people, and it's been done hundreds of times already on prior tests.
It's been done on every single test, yeah.
Every single test. Please stop telling people who call in a panic and freaking out that they're just going to have to wait until January. It is completely unfair, and it is, I think, an attack on the mental health of people who are already under way too much stress. And if I sound angry about this, guess what? Yeah, I am. I'm not going to stop on this issue because I'm frankly pissed off about it.
Yes, you should be. As students should be. Students by the hundreds had issues with this test every day of the test, but particularly Tuesday and Wednesday. And students by the hundreds got the party line as soon as they contacted the people who were responsible to make it right, that there's nothing we can do. You've seen the test. Or what I kept hearing from people, apparently the deciding factor, was you had completed the test. We have a submitted LSAT from you. And it's like, yeah, with a 2.5-hour delay and 7 minutes lost from section 2, how's that the completed test? Is that what you were meant to deliver to me? Because that's not what I intended to submit.
Yeah,
Give me another chance. And so people, I know people, students that have called 20 times before they finally got to someone who said like, okay, or it got escalated up the line to a supervisor who's like, all right, you'll hear from us. I've been hearing from students all morning that they're finally being approved for a makeup tomorrow after 3 days of essentially like a nonstop barrage of help me, please help me. That's entirely unreasonable.
Yeah, and of course, because the volume was so high the last 2 days, the wait times on the phones just skyrocketed. I would have people sending me messages. I've been on the hold for 45 minutes. I've been on hold for an hour and 20 minutes. And I'm like, you have no choice but to just hold. Now, here's what I will say. And this is what I've been told by LSAC when, this problem has come up. And they're aware of certain issues. They're not going to completely disclose everything. But one of their big comments is this, is that when you have a problem with the test, there is a complaint form inside your LSAC account. So log into your account there and fill out the complaint form. And this, I think, is really helpful because it memorializes the issue. It puts it into their system. It also keeps you away from talking to one of their frontline phone people who so often don't know what the situation is and who are very much in a mindset of there's a paper test and there's only one of them and that's what you get. Or there's a digital test on tablet and there's only one of them and that's what you get. That's not true. The Flex is a different type of animal, and one of the big advantages is if you have a problem, they can just give you a different version of it. Also, while I'm at it,
go. No, I like this.
The rant, man.
Dave unleashed.
I'm just irritated, and then I'll be in a better mood after this. There's something I saw online in the midst of all this. At one point, I would say that like 30% of the front page of Reddit on LSAT, on our LSAT was about people who had problems. One of the things that came up was the retake is harder. And I was like, where did this rumor start from? I don't know who started it, but that person is evil. They need to be silenced. That is not the case. They use the regular versions of the Flex that you didn't take, and each of them get their own scale. So if you got a harder RC, you'd get a looser scale for having that. If you get an easier RC later on in the week on a retake, you'd get a tighter scale. So there is no truth to the idea that someone takes a later retake and suddenly it's harder. That's not how this works.
Yeah.
That's not how any of this works.
It's just another form that's already been delivered that week, but that you hadn't seen yet. But what a pathetic commentary, I suppose. That, look, if you want the best service, the last thing you want to do is call and speak to someone. Jesus.
I think what the saying was this, is that when that happens, they're starting to have to connect different pieces. So you've got your test complaint in the system, then you call, and now they've got a new complaint. And what's happening is they're getting multiple complaints together, and then they're trying to sort all that. And what they're saying is it's slowing it down. So I get where they're coming from with this. Sometimes they're like, look, you made your complaint. We're going to process it as quickly as possible. Take from that what you will. If somebody wants to go ahead and submit the form and be done with it, I think that's fine. If they want to call and that's how they want to address it, that's fine. If you want to do both, you do that. Each person has got to do what they think is best for themselves. Advocating for yourself is a really big deal here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't encourage anybody to be like pushy or aggressive, but certainly persistent. People who treat this process passively, I submitted the form, I guess I'll just wait and hear back. We'll see you in January. The service here tends to go to the squeaky wheels.
Yeah, and somebody submitted the form, then they called, and then they were like, well, we have 2 weeks to respond. I'm like, okay, again, you're out of touch with how the process works. You don't have 2 weeks to respond because I need to test this week.
Yeah, you have 2
days. And for a lot of the students that I was talking to, they're like, look, I need to apply now. And, we can debate that at another time, how the urgency of applying at a given time. But look, if I can't take the LSAT in January, or if I don't want to deal with it for 2 months, if I'm ready right now, the right and what you've paid for is to take it now. So, yeah, I swear it irritated the life out of me as I went along and watched this because it's so frustrating. I just want to stand up in the middle of all this and be like, there's a way to handle this. This is information that is misguided. All right. I don't think the people at LSAC are lying on the phones. I just don't think they know. And so I feel bad. I'm not going to yell at them. I'm just like, get up to date on what's going on, though, because it is a recurring problem. And every single time there is false or at least misinformation floating around out there. And I want it to stop. Because it's making my life hell.
Yeah,
it's making your life hell. And it's making a bunch of students' lives hell. And collectively, I know we're all angry about it.
Yeah, I can stomach the problems personally, but it becomes a whole lot tougher pill to swallow when I see it happen to hundreds of people and they're being told, whether it's intentional or not, I don't think it is, but they're being told lies. You can take the test again this week. If something goes wrong, you don't have to wait to the next administration. It may take a couple of calls and some emails and filling out the form and a little bit of, like I say, self-insistence. But yeah, stick to your guns here. This is time for basically you to put your lawyer shoes on. Like, fight for yourself.
Yeah, and I want to clarify that. I don't think it's a lie. I think what you have in a lot of cases is very innocent. Let's just imagine you were a person that worked part-time for LSAC and you answered phones there kind of like intermittently. It wasn't your primary job. Maybe you're a retiree and it's just something you do, make a little extra money, have a little fun. And so they add you onto the staff when they know there's going to be high peak calls. Perfect. All right. So now you're added. You might work 4 or 5 times a year and you might work, maybe 50, 60 hours for them on a yearly basis. Do you know what's going on with the Flex? Of course not. You might have worked there 10 years doing this. You're just used to the way it was forever, and it didn't change for years and years and years. The new world, totally different. This is a completely different test. So you're like, no, you've already seen the test. And people reported their proctor or the person they were talking to on the phone was incredibly nice, but they would tell them this. And I was like, yeah, this is a person who probably has worked there for a while, doesn't work frequently, and doesn't understand that what they're saying is categorically wrong.
Sorry, it's not a lie. It's a falsehood. It's an objective untruth. Great.
And I'm sure right now LSAC is like, how much longer are you guys going to talk about this?
Talk about it till they fix it. How about that?
Yeah.
There's
It's
your
going to come
deadline.
up every single episode because I will not stand for this. And I mean, good, clean, truthful information is obviously at a premium, as we've seen in the recent election. So I want the truth out there when we start dealing with the LSAT of all things. You know, this is the legal system. I want justice when it comes down to this. Let's comment on two
Fair
other
enough.
things
All right.
before we start getting into this test. We'll step off the soapbox or down from the pulpit because I don't want to be angry, man. I don't like that. It's no fun. I want things to go smoothly. And honestly, I know that people at LSAC do as well. A couple other things that we saw online that I thought were really interesting. One of them is very broad. So a lot of people talking about their section order and then assuming they had the same section content.
Right.
That is not the case. Section order is not indicative of you having the same content as somebody else. So if you and I both had RC, then LG, then LR, it's very possible that we had one or more sections in common. It's also possible we had no sections in common. So just keep in mind, I know people get online and they're like, oh yeah, you had the same section order as me. Oh, your test was hard. I feel bad. Now I'm worried I misunderstood it. No. You're operating with only partial information there. It is not something where you can make a judgment. You have to understand what content they had. And you see people saying, oh, I had the Forest RC, for example. Oh, I had that too. Then you know you had the same RC. Doesn't mean you had the same LG or LR. It changes constantly throughout the day and over the successive days. And we will once again talk about that in detail.
Yeah, I've seen that endlessly. And ditto the inverse, by the way, is just because you have a different section order from someone doesn't mean any of your content was different. You and I can have the exact same test content, but rearranged for the two of us.
Yeah, excellent point. I'll make one more specific comment that I saw that came up about reading comprehension and logic games. I had a number of people report that they went from one passage to the next, and because they'd scrolled down in the first passage, when they went into the second one, it was already pre-scrolled down. And a number of people discovered, oh my gosh, I missed the first paragraph. And they found that out, either after a few seconds or after a few minutes. But it is a good idea in reading comprehension as you go to each new passage to make sure that you are at the top of the passage so that you're able to read everything. And there's a reverse thing like that on games, John. What is it?
Yeah, I had a student report this to me after, I think it was the August test, where he was like, man, there was just a perfectly clean, I guess the size of the text he was using in the interface, there was a perfectly clean break between like rule 4 and 5. And I didn't know to scroll down, so I didn't have the fifth rule in my setup.
Oh.
And he's like, it took me several questions to realize something was badly wrong here. His spidey senses were tingling, but he couldn't put his finger on it. And he finally went back. He's like, did I misread something? Oh, I didn't scroll. And he scrolled down and caught the fifth rule, and everything made sense. But minutes had been lost at that point. So just pay attention essentially to the fact that the passage, the games, can essentially require more of the screen than it displays at first. You may have to scroll up and down to see the whole thing.
Yeah, there needs to be like an arrow, an up or down that indicates that there's content that is present there.
Some sort of like ellipsis at the end that shows there's more.
Yeah, something that tells you that there's text elsewhere that you may not be seeing. All right, so on all those notes of complaint, casting vitriol and aspersions upon the waters, let's move on to talking a little bit about the test that we just had. And I'm going to, as always, preface this conversation by saying if we say something is easier than another section, we are not saying it is easy. My belief is that all LSAT sections are challenging. They all have difficulty. There is no section that you do where everything's just, gosh, that was simple. They don't exist. It's all in a sphere of relativity. So somebody may have had a harder section, and I may say that, well, I think this was the hardest of the reading comprehension sections. That doesn't mean yours was suddenly easy. It is not built like that. So just keep that in mind, because I don't want anyone to be like, they said it was easy, and then they're bummed out. I'm like, no.
Yeah,
it's still hard. It's
the absolutes only go in one
side
direction here. If we say something is harder, I think it's fair to say it's hard. Easier doesn't mean easy, though. That's the absolute you can't drop. So Fair. There's one other disclaimer that we tend to put here at the outset, which is that we're going to talk about the test in a way that's allowed and the way that students are allowed to talk about it, which is by topic. We're not going to talk about strategies, answer choices, or solutions. We're not even going to get into like, oh, that third game was, advanced linear. We're not going to do any of that. So if anyone hears this and happens to maybe see a set of these tests later, we haven't done anything to like give you any kind of advantageous insights. This is merely, as you say, a digital witness, a catalog of what's occurred, but not how to have better approached it.
Yeah, and every time you see these tests going and you see people running around trying to get information about what might be coming up, and I've said repeatedly, I believe that is a fool's errand, because you start thinking so much about what you might or might not see that what ends up happening is you forget to focus on what is right in front of you, which is the questions you need to answer.
Yeah, what you're actually seeing.
So, interestingly enough, as we get into this test, one of the things that we did in the crystal ball is we talked about what might they actually do in terms of drawing questions from various eras. I had hoped that they might use the February 2018 LSAT in this particular exam. They did not. So that makes me think that there's a really high chance it might be used in January. Although, quite honestly, I know that LSAC listens to this, and it could be that me saying that right here has just now stopped it from happening.
Yeah,
the observer.
some poor administrator over there just went straight back to the keyboard. Like, well,
no Feb 18
memo.
But one of the things that we did say was that we felt very strongly that these tests would be pulled from the prep test 80s era, and a number of the sources were from that general vicinity. So we were right about that in terms of like the overall era, although probably not fully right yet about Feb 2018, because they said if it's not used in November, I think it's going to come up relatively soon. And I do think we're still going to see that test soon.
Yeah.
So
it's inevitable.
Break it down. Let's talk about what happened on Saturday morning, because get up on Saturday morning nice and early. Test starts at 7 a.m. Eastern for some people, if that's the time that they've chosen. I think insanely, but that's the time they chose. I could, was still asleep, kind of.
I was still awake, for what it's worth.
That's right. You were still awake.
I tweeted
got
something
up really
right
early
as the
to
test
send
started.
some tweets and then went right back to sleep. I was like, I can't deal. Interestingly enough, they started off with a test that's right around Prep Test 80, and this was a test from December 2016. It was the European LSAT. And in the crystal ball, I said, look, there's a good chance that we may see some international or previous like Sabbath accommodated test versions. So this was no big surprise. And Jon, how do you feel about this? Do you want to run through these sections? You want me to run through it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Chime in as we go. So this, again, the December 2016 international test from Europe, round prep test 80. I'll just do this in the typical order. So I'll go games first. 23 questions in games. Here were the 4 subjects of the games, I believe, in order. There were 5 witnesses being selected out of, I think, 7. There was one about a museum or a gallery, the floors of it with different like medium sculpture painting and things on them. A game about scholarships. And for anyone who had this particular section, that's probably a bit triggering. I'm sorry. This was the toughest, I think, of the 4. Humanities, math, science scholarships being awarded. And then finally a game about assigning journalists or reporters to sections of a newspaper. Metro, Life, things like that.
Yeah, and this section, I heard a lot of different comments on it, and I think we know a fair amount about it. And this is how I thought a hard section to get a handle on, because for some people, the response was this wasn't bad. It was very reasonable, especially the first 2 games seemed to go down pretty well. The third game, though, I think almost universally people thought was the hardest. And then that had the usual knock-on effect of causing some people to then struggle even more so with the 4th game because they were low on time.
Yeah.
So I think this was overall a fair section. I mean, none of these games was like shredder level difficulty. I think the other 3 games around, like that third scholarships games, were probably on average harder. But this is going to trend towards like the overall middle of the difficulty level, which we'll see later.
I agree with you. I didn't get the impression this section was anything outrageously tough, but certainly that third game was the toughest. It's funny you mentioned that knockover effect. the compounding of one difficult thing happening around the third spot and how it translates into problems with 4. And we saw it in the reading comp section as well.
We did.
So
yeah, that happened later on with that Goya
Yeah.
passage.
it happened in Goya. It happened on this test. The value theory passage, I think, made the fourth passage here more difficult than it would have been in isolation.
Run through, since you're talking about it, just continue the run through on
Sure.
on the RC from that test.
One interesting standout from this 27 question RC was that it started with comparative reading. It's pretty unusual. Specifically, this was a UN Declaration about Human Rights, was the comparative passage. There was a passage about, kind of interesting to me, silkworms and their role, I suppose, in like Colombian coffee production or something. Here comes the beastly one. The third passage was about relativism and subjectivist I don't know, tendencies or nomenclature, and a guy, I believe Alain Locke, talking about value theory. Again, it's a bit convoluted. There were a lot of different talking points. Right? This was a passage I saw described about 15 different ways by people. None of which were describing it in positive terms.
No, everybody hated it.
But the titling of this I saw take a lot of variety. And then that led into a fourth passage on the evolution of bipedalism in hominids, which again, I would think was interesting. That didn't seem like that tough of a passage, except for the fact that it came on the heels of value theory. So I think people were pressed for time and maybe just distraught in general.
Yeah, the value theory, the Alain Locke one, which was the third passage, was clearly difficult. Saw a lot of complaints about it, and it created that knock-on effect where all of a sudden the fourth passage, which otherwise in a vacuum might have felt okay to people, now felt really tough because they were running out of time. And so we had this 3-4 kind of positioning problem where the third is harder and causes the fourth to then also be hard. There is also a really interesting kind of like little thing in here because in the very first moments of Saturday morning, as I was looking at this, I was like, maybe we called February 2018 correctly because Alain Locke features on the February 2018 test. And then, of course, I had that second thought in my mind. I was like, did LSAC do this to me on purpose? Did they use two different LSATs with Alain Locke to be confusing? Because I'm not going to get caught by that trap. And I don't know that that was the case, but I will forever think that maybe this was an intentional thing by them to mess with me.
That's funny.
But
in any other context, I would call that far-fetched.
Yeah, this is the same thing as having passages about serotonin or dinosaurs or Bumblebee Waggle Dance. There's been common passages with the same topic at various eras and junctures across time. So this just happens to be somebody who wrote these passages, knew a lot about Alain Locke, and featured that person in two different passages. So I had a moment for a second on Saturday. I was like, this could be the best weekend of the year, but it turned into just be another okay weekend.
I had a slightly different sort of chin scratch with this one. I was thinking, those rascals, if they're going to use Alain Locke here, I bet they also use February 18 because that creates more confusion to have two different passage sets with an overlapping topic. I was like, I see what they're up to. And of course,
that would be vicious.
No.
They've done that kind of thing too in logic games where you see that and you're like, wait a second, that game had the vase, but that game also had a vase.
Right.
And it gets really confusing for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know they like to do that when they can. Let's talk about LR because we saw both sections of the December 2016 Euro. Logical reasoning, one with 26 questions, one with 25. All of this started rolling out first thing Saturday morning. The 26 question LR, it was a question about rats and pellets, people disagreeing about science fiction novel. It was one about Mars, lakes and rivers. They love that water on Mars idea. We've seen that a bunch. A tough one that I saw a lot of people talking about was fine thread, polyester content, and fabrics. And again, a number of them. I think towards the end we saw one about frogs disappearing or a frog disappearing. Age of the Earth by the rate of cooling. So again, a fairly standard collection of things. We saw some science, some humanities, some history, some nonsense. But that was the 26 question LR. And there was another one, the 25 question LR. I saw more content discussed with this one. I don't know if that's because it appeared more often or people just remembered it better. Maybe there were some more standout features. There was a question early about squirrels covering their body with rattlesnake venom, aloe vera, cosmetics, geese in a V migration pattern. people got a lot of attention from that. One that had some confusion around it, T-Rex fossils and their sinuses. I saw people calling this turbines, but it was turbinates in T-Rex sinus fossils.
That'll confuse you if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I was looking for a passage or something on wind, but no.
Wind turbines.
Or yeah, something with engines. Jurors using cell phones and the difficulty of sequestering them. BMI, body mass index question that got, again, a lot of attention. Aristotle was in this. A nuclear facility license, a question about seatbelts and drunk driving. So, again, a section that we had a fair amount of information on as we went through it. And that was the December 2016 Euro test.
Yeah, and that's what they started off by using was, sections from this. Now I'm going to point something out. We are talking about Saturday morning. We're doing it chronologically by order of introduction. These sections were used throughout the week.
Yeah.
So if you took the test on Tuesday or Wednesday and you're sitting here saying, wait, I had those too? Yeah, that's totally normal. Nothing unusual about it. So you might have had the same reading comprehension that people on Saturday morning and Sunday, for that matter, had. You might have had something different. So this is the first introduction of these sections. But what happens is as they introduce the pieces, they then start folding them back in and mixing them up so that by the end of the week, you're seeing combinations of all sorts of different sections from different days. So we do it in this order because it's convenient chronologically. But to be entirely honest, you could have had taken this test on any day that they were administering it and still had these sections.
Yeah, very fair point. This is first appearance, but definitely not last appearance. In fact, you could be listening to this and have a makeup tomorrow, not have seen these sections yet, and tomorrow you get a question about body mass index. Entirely possible.
So these two sections are interesting because there was a lot of conversation about them, and certainly I've heard a lot of various opinions and have some of my own because I know a lot about the December 2016 administration of this. There are always difficult questions on here. For example, like that body mass index question. A lot of people were like, that was a tough question. Or that thread and polyester count question with like silk, cotton, and the fine fabrics in the other section. These are tough questions. So whenever we say that these two sections were fair, and that's what we're going to say, that doesn't mean that they were easy. It doesn't mean that every question was, fairly simple or that there were no tough questions. Every single logical reasoning section in history has tough questions on it. These are no different. Now, on an overall level, did they rank out as like being extremely difficult or impossible? No, I wouldn't say that. I do think they were tough at times. There's no question about that. So if you're like, well, I struggle with this, this, and this, that is okay. That is to be expected. I don't think, though, that these were unfair sections or anything that was changing the scaling as we look at it.
Yeah, I know there's some people right now still thinking about geese migrations who probably want to fight you, but it's a very hard question.
It's never about the hardest questions.
But it's not
about
yet.
The number of other fair questions.
These are outliers, as it turns out.
Yeah, what I want to see is a section like any other that has a couple of hard questions, but then has a lot of questions that are on the easy to middle side. And then I can think about those tougher questions for a longer period of time during the section. I don't want to see a test that has a whole bunch of like kind of upper mid-level difficulty because you're going to miss some of those over time. It's just going to fatigue you out and then throws a few tough ones on top of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think these sections figured with that. I do think they're more in the new style where things are a little bit less clear and more murky in terms of the presentation. I can see them moving around the various question types, which we're not going to talk about, where they're sometimes focusing on maybe questions that don't appear quite as frequently on most tests. So overall, though, if you go back to what we predicted would happen with this test and how they started it, we predicted it would be, again, in the middle of the road and be very fair and would be kind of like an 80s style test. I would say that's exactly what we got. So I feel really good about what we were predicting versus what was actually delivered on test day.
Yeah, I
so
do too.
Raises for us.
Yeah, I'm fine to take that. And again, no outlier games yet. Not to say easy games, but nothing in the the mapping kind of category. So everything that we
Pattern.
more or less expected from from broad topic or a broad categorization type has happened exactly as we thought. And it continued through the day. This was not the only content that we saw on Saturday. Towards Saturday afternoon, a new reading comprehension section was introduced. So we've seen it from December 2016 Euro, and then we started hearing whispers of some different passage topics. Whole new section, 27 questions again. And here's what we saw in that. It started with a passage about the African American Renaissance, art in Harlem. There was one about EU, European Union, forests, and fairy tales. And again, I'm sure a cold shiver just ran through somebody. Another passage in there, the third, the comparative, about acoustic law, the rule of law and judicial rules and separation. And then again, a passage I would love to read about club cells in fish skin, and I suppose avoiding predation by birds.
Yeah, I heard some complaints about the forests, but I heard the majority of complaints. Yeah, certainly, some people liked it better than others. But that law passage that was third, I heard a lot of complaints about this. And you're starting to see a pattern already. On the first RC, that was, in my opinion, the hardest of the early sections that were used. They then replaced it with this reading comprehension, which really, the sourcing of that is tougher to find. This comes from like a number of tests from the past where you've got like international usage and so forth. This passage set I thought was hard again. Again, one more time for the difficulty of that acoustic passage was apparently rather brutal and extremely dense with some of the stuff that you were seeing, especially in forest and the acoustic passage.
So yeah, the law passages in both of these apparently threw people for a bit of a loop. And again, to be expected, we told you there'd be one on each, and there was, and it was tough. So acoustic law, shame on you.
I mean, it brings up an interesting question about like pick your poison when it comes to where the difficulty is going to appear. Yeah, personally, I'd like every section to be kind of in the middle and just be happy about that. But usually one of the sections is going to be slightly harder. Do you want that in games? Do you want that in reasoning? Do you want it in reading comprehension? I'm a really comfortable reader, and I know you are as well. So we feel good about it. But I don't like to see this for students because this is 27 of the 75 or 76 questions. And I don't like to see the high-level difficulty appearing in what is the most weighted portion of the test by question count.
So, yeah, it's interesting too. I feel like the difficulty in reading comprehension is much more of an objective thing. People are just going to struggle no matter who you are, to some extent, versus difficulty in games is far more subjective to me. You can put any game in front of you or in front of me or in front of people who know what they're doing, and it really doesn't matter how other people do. I'm going to get everything right. It's not going to be that bad. Reading comp, though, poses more of a risk, as I see it.
I like your humbleness.
Well,
I'm going to get everything right.
It's different if it's not true.
I agree. So that reading comprehension came in, and I thought it was a tough section again. So I wasn't real thrilled by that, but that's what happens. And I knew the scale would offset that eventually. So we'll get to that part of the discussion. They weren't done, though, and that surprised me so much. When that second reading comp came out, I've been thinking for a while that they were going to have fewer sections being used. We've said it on our podcast the last couple of times. They don't need to have 45 or 54 combinations of all of this. So when they brought out another new section on Saturday, I have to admit that my heart dropped a little bit. I was like, are we going to have to like track 54 combinations of this because this is such a big test? What did they do on late Saturday afternoon?
Aside from keeping us both anchored to our chairs, to our computers, because we had to keep on guard for more content. When they introduced that new reading comp, I had the same feeling. I was like, that's plenty. That's enough, guys. Call it a day. They did not call it a day. There was another logical reasoning section, a third for Saturday, that came into play. And a couple of the topics that we saw from that, there was one about Edgar Allan Poe, Latin, I think, in works. One I saw a lot of talking about cannonball arts, planet orbiting stars, car manufacturing. So all brand new stuff. It was pretty clear to us immediately that we were dealing with a new set of LR here.
Yeah. And I will say this about this section. Right down the middle, it seemed like to me. Again, always hard questions here, but there was nothing that was coming out of this section or what we were seeing or the reports that we were getting that suggested to us that this was somehow unreasonably hard. And again, there are always tricky questions that are floating around in here. So if you're counting at this point, there were 6 possible variations of the test that they could have given you on Saturday. You had one Logic Games version that was used all day long. You had 2 possible reading comps that you could have gotten, and you had one of 3 possible logical reasoning sections that were floating around. Now, if you think about that from a student perspective, 6 different versions of the test, there's a form of roulette here.
Yeah.
They're just randomly spitting these out at people. You don't know what you're getting. You can even see how if you were thinking to yourself, I'm going to find out what all the topics are and I'm taking it on Sunday, how daunting it would be to even learn anything about what you were looking at. It would be so much effort just to track all of this, and I can speak from experience, having done this every time,
Yeah,
that I don't think it's
from
worth
the
it.
last few days of experience. It is tough.
Always on Saturday, you and I are like bright-eyed, and we're like, what are they doing? We're really interested in the cat and mouse aspect of it. By Thursday, by yesterday, I was exhausted. Doing this 4 out of the 5 days had just left me
a shell of a man.
A shell of a person. There's only a ghost in the shell at that point. And the part of it is talking to a lot of people and having to, unfortunately, have the same conversation about people having issues with the tech portion of Proctor U was frustrating, and that's wearing as well. But that was Saturday. And you can see, if you look at this and you figure about how we talk about scaling, reading comp was the big issue to us. That's what stood out as being overly difficult. Didn't feel like the games were unreasonable. Didn't feel like the logical reasoning was unreasonable. So then we woke on Sunday.
Yes,
a new day had dawned.
I love that you said we were both bright-eyed on Saturday. Speak for yourself, boy.
The funny thing, John, is that the quarantine skill that I have learned is I can now make pizza from scratch.
Oh, that's cool.
So that's what I did on Saturday in the moments when I wasn't doing the LSAT. And then every time I'd be making it, I'd be thinking about the LSAT. I was like, this pizza's going to taste terrible. Turned out all right. So
it's pizza. I'm sure it did.
Too much LSAT thinking. You got to love the pizza.
Well, as we'll maybe see later.
There's pizza still to come.
That's right. Let's talk about Sunday then. So we get up. We're curious to see what they do because at this point, with 3 LRs, 2 RCs, and 1 game, there's a lot of content already in play. And they started Sunday with another set of logic games. So 23 questions. Here's what we woke to. Another game about paintings and sculptures. So clearly they're a fan of that. Zoo veterinarian visits, animals being taken to a vet. Cuisines featured at a restaurant. And then finally, different regional cuisines. And then finally, I think the toughest game here at the end about finance and oversight committees.
Yeah, I think the cuisines are like Greek on there,
Nigerian, Hungarian,
yeah, stuff like that. Which sounds like an interesting game. I can't wait to actually do it at some point in the future. But in this case, the last game, the finance and oversight committees, I think was the toughest of the games, and I heard some complaints about it, but not enough, again, to make me think that I was looking at anything like the shredder. I think there was a way to work through that. And if you're like, what's he talking about, the shredder? There was a game on the last LSAT that was really tough, and the first 3 games were fairly reasonable, but it ended with a brutalizing game that was truly a challenge. I don't think this game was at that level in terms of difficulty.
Yeah, machines in a shop, and one of them was a shredder. And shredder was the word that stuck because that's how people felt.
People also got pressed and riveted in that game.
Pressed and riveted. Yeah.
And then shredded. But like this finance oversight committee game, I can see references back in our files to a similar game on the October 2015 in Asia LSAT that was given out there. So we have some history with these kinds of things. And back then, people were talking about how tough that game was. So I think this was a difficult game for sure. I don't think the section as a whole was terribly difficult. The paintings and sculptures in the zoo vet was glossed over by so many people who really were like, I hardly remember those games. Usually when you have a large group of people, and certainly the reports that we got on this test confirm this, who really don't recall a whole lot about it, it means that it wasn't terrible. Wasn't anything that stopped them and really made them focus in. Started to hear more about the cuisines game, and then certainly the finance and oversight was probably the kingpin of difficulty in this section.
Reminding me a little bit of the games from Saturday, where there was that one game on Saturday morning, the scholarships. This seemed to be the standout, but on the whole, still fairly middle of the road.
Yeah. All right, so that was Sunday. I think that was the only section they added in on Sunday, which doubles the number of possible outcomes that you're working with. You had 6, now you got 12 that are floating around out there.
Personal gripe about this. They kept us, basically, speaking of riveted, they kept us here late into Saturday because they continued to introduce things. Sunday, they got an early start with novelty and stopped. And so you and I just kind of sat here waiting for the other shoe to drop,
Yeah.
unfulfilled.
Getting reports from instructors and students and things like that, and just being like, come on, same thing. I already got that. Come on.
Right.
I mean, like I said, it's a battle. It'd be like and this is completely exaggerated, in a wartime thing where it's just like the other side takes a day off, and you're like, what are you going to do? I'm ready to counter your move here, or at least to like analyze troop movements.
Yeah.
Nothing happened.
A month of night raids and then silence. Where are they? What's happening here?
I'm ready for your night raid, and they're not coming in.
The blitz.
So then Monday, no test.
Yes.
Glorious.
Yeah, so you and I both got to catch our breaths a little bit, although most of Monday, instead of data gathering, was spent student interfacing, I suppose. We were out there talking to a lot of people through the weekend, especially people who'd had some problems through the weekend because they weren't absent. Telling them basically, look, go advocate for yourself, push for this makeup. They will do a makeup on Friday if you qualify for it, as we've already covered.
Yeah.
So Monday wasn't exactly a day of rest. It was just a day of difference.
No, after working all weekend, Monday didn't feel, then I had to work on Monday. So I wasn't like, oh, vacation time.
Right.
It's not like I could, take off to Las Vegas for the, one nighter or something like that.
Right. As though you would anyway, but still.
I used to.
You might. Yeah, you did used to. We used to.
I've taken trips to Las Vegas where I arrived, never slept, and then got back on the plane and left. That's a good trip.
I've gone to and returned from Las Vegas 3 times in 7 days.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I feel you.
So we get to Tuesday. The Tuesday test shows up. Well, what happened?
Again, they start off Tuesday morning with some new content. So right now it's 2, 2, and 3, games, reading, LR. And then Tuesday morning they introduce straight away a new section of reading comprehension. From about the same time period, we've been looking at tests in the early 80s mostly. This was experimental from June 2018. At least that's the reference I saw to it.
All of these passages came from that test. They were used as experimentals on that exam. We had all of them locked in almost immediately. I think as soon as we saw Goya was in play, I was like, I know this. I remember this coming up before we were able to go back into the database on it, all of it.
That's funny. That was the trigger for me too. As soon as I saw Goya, I was like, oh yeah, wait.
But then the Canadian, the first passage here about the indigenous tribes in Canada and so forth, I was like, I know that one's out there too, and then we were able to hunt that down, and we're like, all right, this is all coming from the same era.
Yeah.
So what was the lineup here?
And that's how it started. It started with a passage about Canadian national parks and the removal of indigenous tribes populations from those parks. Then it went to a scientific journals on the internet. So some sort of social media type analysis of vaccines, apparently. Then we got to number 3, the Goya passage about the black paintings that he had done towards his latter career. And then finally it wrapped up with a passage about punishment in law, scales of justice. So that was the 4-section layout that you had there.
Which is interesting because I heard a lot of complaints about the first passage and the third passage in particular. A lot of people, the funniest comment I saw was, I'm never going to Canada and I'm not going to a national park now in Canada. Because people were like, I didn't like that passage and I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Which, I like using some comedy to blunt trauma. And that certainly works in this case. If you're traumatized by that passage, it's nice to joke about it.
Yeah.
But I think that passage was harder, and it was more dense than a lot of people expected in the first passage because you so rarely see higher levels of difficulty there. And then also I heard a similar type of complaint about that Goya passage. And it's interesting because you and I are both art fans, and we're both familiar with Goya. And I think I would love to read that passage. But then again, you have to be careful about what you ask for, because I might be like, oh, I love art, I love Goya. And then I might read it and think this is horrible. So I can't really tell, but I think for a lot of people, they weren't as inclined to be positive towards it, and they did not enjoy the passage.
Yeah. So, in fact, I'll echo that. There's a degree of danger, I think, seeing passages about things with which you're at least vaguely familiar. because
Yeah.
it's easy, I think, then to process the passage through your own understanding or expectations and experience. I know a fair amount of Goya. I know a fair amount. I was telling you the other day about this black paintings thing he did, where slowly kind of losing his mind and under intense sort of threats and feelings of self-persecution, he started just painting murals on the inside of his house on all the walls. And at his death, the government kind of took the house over and went in and stripped all the wallpaper off and turned it into essentially an exhibition of Goya paintings that he had never intended to be public. That was the series of black paintings. The
Hmm.
most famous, I think, is Saturn devouring his offspring. If you've ever seen this,
Which
it's
is,
this like big
yeah.
scary monster ripping the head off something in his hands.
Oh, it's disturbed.
It's yeah,
For sure. That is a crazy picture. That's probably, in my opinion, his most famous picture. And it is, go
probably
look it
yeah.
up if you've never seen it, and you'll be like, that's unsettling at the very, very least.
Yeah, not the work of a man in his right mind, but
If
a
anyone.
prodigious talent. I'll give him that. But anyway, that passage, I even saw some people posting online where they're like, dude, I studied Goya in college and couldn't make sense of this. So clearly, familiarity in this case did not necessarily breed understanding.
It bred contempt.
It might have bred a bit of contempt, and a lot of contempt, like a South Park song for Canada.
Blame Canada.
Canada.
Academy Award nominated, even.
Indeed.
In fact, one of the
Which
most
gives me
interesting
hope.
performances on the Academy Award is when Robin Williams sang that song at the Academy Awards, however many years ago it was.
Well, screw St. Vincent. I know what I'm looking up as soon as this ends.
You know what? You're totally right. We should have done Blame Canada.
That's our song.
And it should have been the Robin Williams version performance of it. We messed up.
Better
Now
late
I'm
than never.
disappointed.
Honorable mention. Blame Canada. Parker
So
instead.
we'll see if we can link to that, because that's a great performance of that song, which is so funny.
All right.
Anyway.
That was not the only new thing though from Tuesday. That's the new reading comp from Tuesday. So now we had 3 different sections, 12 passages. And then we got a new set of games, 4 more. There was a game about spices in and out. I saw some Simon and Garfunkel references here with parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, also oregano in this. There was there was a passage about movie theaters, or movies in theaters, a couple of them. Tutoring music lessons, piano and I think violin, which is something we've seen before. Students being tutored. And then finally a passage about an antique auction, different types of things like furniture. So fairly standard talking points or topics here, and a fairly standard section of games. It was hard for me in a way to get a grip on exactly what the toughest thing here was. There wasn't to me such a standout singularity like we had seen.
Yeah. It might be that movies game.
Maybe.
It's hard to tell, but you reading that and the comments you made struck me that we didn't screw up just once by missing songs. We screwed up twice.
Uh-oh.
We could have used the Simon and Garfunkel song on this. And that's like, Paul Simon, who I'm not a huge fan of Paul Simon, but I actually like Simon and Garfunkel. That's like a 60s band. They do The Sound of Silence, which is their classic song, which is, I think, was it from The Graduate? It's an amazing song.
It's used in the movie The Graduate.
Yeah, and they've done this. So if you haven't listened to them, go listen to them. So we screwed up twice, John.
I know.
I'm going to blame fatigue. It's been a long week.
I'm going to still blame Canada.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I'm
Blame
exhausted.
Canada and Simon and Garfunkel would have been the choices for music this week. But I like St. Vincent, so I'm happy.
Yeah, I'm not mad about it. Anyway, we've got lots of tunes. We're getting slowly but surely getting an LSAT playlist together here. I'm fine with it.
Dude, we're 70 plus episodes in. We've got like multiple albums of playlists that are ready to go. We should just create the Spotify playlist for this and be like, if you want to hear the music that we thought was cool for these podcasts, here you go. So if anybody wants us to do that, one person has to send a message and then I'll do it. If no one says anything, I'm not doing it though. Okay. It's too much work.
Good. Well, I'm glad you volunteered yourself. I'm over here hiding under a desk.
I'm not going to do it. I'm going to have someone do it.
That was all Tuesday morning. So a fairly early start to Tuesday. We saw new games. We saw new passages. At this point, we've got 3, 3, and 3 in play.
Yeah.
No new LR, though, since Saturday.
No. I mean, they've thrown in enough that I feel like they were mixing it around. So we get to Wednesday. What happens on Wednesday? Do we get new sections?
Aside from me still violently crossing my fingers for February 2018, so we look like clairvoyants, nothing happened Wednesday, including February 18. It was just a reuse of everything we'd seen so far.
Yeah, so I think we'll probably see February 2018 in January or February. Hoping for January, obviously, because I know that's a fair test, and I'd love to see it being used as the base for those exams. But this brings us to a really interesting point. You only had 27 combinations of exams. As you just said, 3 games, 3 reading comps, and 3 LR.
Mm-hmm.
So as we look at that and we kind of like figure it out, that is down from what we saw in the last 2 tests. In August, we saw 54 versions, so twice as many. And then in the following test, we saw 45.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was October. And now we come down to 27. And I think this is probably something that we will see as a fairly standard feature. The next couple of LSATs are just on Saturday and Sunday. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw just like 12 variations over 2 days. I think when they have several days spaced out, they want to get over 20 different variations. And so this is pretty normal, but they never needed 54 for that August test. I think it was burning sections they didn't need to burn. And I think they learned that lesson. And you and I have certainly talked about how from a cheating standpoint, I know this is all about anti-cheating methods and so forth, and that's what they're attempting to do. I think it's incredibly hard to cheat on this test, virtually impossible.
Yeah.
And so 27 is still a lot of sections and really, really difficult to even conceive of cheating or getting any kind of meaningful advantage. So that brings us all the way through our review of it. Nice job. You handled the yeoman's work there of getting through all those sections. And it brings us... Yeah, it brings us to the final discussion, which is, as always, the matrix of score possibilities. And I will remind everybody of a couple different things here. The first is, as we go through this, what you want to do is know what the baseline is that we're going to start with. And we're going to start from a score to get a 170 that would allow you to miss 7 questions. That is the baseline that we will use. So you have to start from 7 and then find your section and either keep it the same depending upon the difficulty, add a question, or as the case may be or may not be in this test, take one away from that. So that's how it works. And Jon often makes this comment, but I will make it in his stead since he just did all the talking. We're always conservative. If we think that it's kind of like, well, it could be this or this, we'll go on the conservative side of things. So that is to not give a misimpression and to get somebody thinking, oh, this scale's really loose, and then it turns out that it's not. Far better to think that it's going to be tight and it turns out to be loose than to think that it's going to be loose and it turns out to be tight. Yeah. So we're always conservative, and I don't know if you have anything to add to that point there.
No, I think that covers it.
All right, so the key here is to figure out which of the 27 combinations that you've had. And so starting from -7, let's go through the logic games, and then I will talk about how that affects our view. And it's interesting because the first game that they used was that logic game section from December of 2016, the European test with the museum floors, the scholarships, the journalists, the reporters, and so forth. And Jon and I debated this for a long time as to whether or not we should have this as 0 or having that overall section add 1. And it's funny because when I was thinking about this section before, I was still thinking about me being on 0 with it. But I think you won that argument at the end, and we decided to add 1 to the scale for this. So if you had this section, instead of thinking of -7 to get a 170, you now would go to -8. Fair?
It is fair. Jon? The comment that I made and what swayed me to move off of 0 was that of the 3 sections of games that we saw over the past week, I think this was the hardest overall set. So if anything is going to influence the scale, I think this set of games, in that particular context, in games, I think this was the set that would do it.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before. The difficulty of doing this is that we're doing it binary, because to do it otherwise is just an impossible mathematical problem.
Binary in the sense we're not, it's not fractional. We're not like that. Probably moves at 0.6.
We're doing whole numbers. There are times when we look at this and we're like, okay, that might be 1.25. That might be 1. That might be 0.75. But to try to, parse that out would just be ludicrous. And so this was the hardest of the 3. In fact, I think they introduced them in order of difficulty over all the sections.
I got that feeling.
So we're going to say this one adds 1 to the scale and loosens it by 1. The next scale that came, or the next LG that came out, was the one that featured the painting and the sculpture, the zoo vet, the cuisines at the restaurant, and then that difficult game at the end, operations and finance. And I think that last game was difficult. However, we don't think this section was as hard as the first one, and so we're going to leave it at no effect. This is a 0. So if you start at -7 and this was your section, you're still at -7 to get a 170. That's the so-called curve that we use to talk about this. And then the last section, which I think was the easiest of the three, was the one where you had the spices, the rosemary, sage, etc. You had the movie theaters, you had the music lessons, the tutoring, and then finally like the auction, which I think was of antiques. I think this was the easiest, despite the fact that there were 2 rule substitution questions on this, which up the difficulty because they're more time consuming. But we're going to leave this at 0 as well. So everybody listening right now, depending upon which of the 3 logic game sections you had, you're either at -7 for a 170 or -8 for a 170. And if that whole conversation, like what are they talking about, -7, -8, there's a blog post that I wrote that says, what does -6, 7, 8, 9 mean when talking about the LSAT-Flex scale? It's on the second page of our blog. Go check that out. All right, so everybody's at 7 or 8 right now. Here's the beauty of reading comprehension. All these add 1 to the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had the value theory with Elaine Locke and the bipedalism, add 1. If you had the Harlem art and the fairy tale force and the acoustic law one, you add a point. It loosens it up. If you had Goya and the scientific publication and the national parks and the punishment, add 1. Reading comp, we think all those sections were hard. We think all of them loosen the scale by 1. So now everybody's either at 8 or 9, I think is the way that it works. And it's going to stay that way because out of all the logical reasoning, all these are going to be zeroed, meaning they don't add or affect the scale positively or negatively. In other words, their difficulty was as we expected it to be. So it doesn't matter whether that was you had the rat section, the lakes on Mars, and the polyester fabrics, that's 0. You might have had the squirrels one with the aloe vera and the body mass index, 0. Or maybe you had the one about Poe and the cannonball art and so forth, 0. And God knows, John, maybe we missed one in all of this because I know sometimes it gets, the word I'll use is stultifying. I actually taught that word to my daughter last night. She was asking me what it was I was doing for the last 5 days, and I explained it, and I said it was stultifying.
Why are you giving her words she can use to insult you? Don't do that.
Not me, her playmates.
Oh, that's right.
If she's using words that her friends don't know, not that she's been within 6 feet of any other person aside family in the last 6 months, then they won't get mad at her if she says something.
That's fair.
mean.
Yeah, Little Miss Popular, insulting people under the radar.
This is my parenting style. Let me teach you how to say things to people where they have no idea what you said, so you don't get in trouble.
Bravo.
Anyway, that leaves all the scales there. Basically at either -8 or -9. And I'll be honest, part of our thinking here has been influenced by that May 2020 scale that we saw. That scale, as we've talked about previously, was very loose.
Mm-hmm.
And made me think that a lot of these scales might be a little bit looser than we thought they might be. And so when we had the option here with some of this logical reasoning in that last logic games of thinking that it tightened it, we left it at 0. And so that's what you're seeing that is floating around out there. So I know a lot of people were like, oh, this is a -7. I think previously I would have thought that most of these tests were -7, but I'm letting that May 2020 scale have an impact and move it to -8 and then a -9 in one of these cases. And I don't think that's unfair.
I don't either. I think the May test has probably softened me and my expectations by about a half a point. So when in doubt, I have rounded up as opposed to maybe left it where it would have been otherwise. So thank you, May. Thank you, LSAC, for giving it to us.
Yeah, and that's just, you have to go with what information you have or didn't have. When we were making scale predictions in May and, later, we didn't know.
Yeah.
We had a really strong feeling that we were pretty accurate, and I think, we were very accurate overall. Being off by 1 in this kind of environment with no information, I'll take it.
Yeah.
But that gives, you'd be a fool not to learn when you have new information. You see it happen in politics all the time, but it's not going to happen here. We got new information, and we're going to adjust the way that we look at this. And so that's the final call on this. And hopefully you were able to pick out your test in there, and hopefully that's good news for most people, because I know a lot of people were fearful that these tests felt normal and that was going to be a really tight scale. I don't think it's going to be super tight, and I certainly hope that I'm right about that and feel that I am.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be punitive. Is it going to go to -10? I'd be shocked. But I do think a -9 is reasonable, and I think a -8 for most of these is probably the landing point. So yeah, I'm with you. You mentioned
Yeah.
politics. I'll just quickly say that in the last one, you said your hope for this next episode is that we'll have a president by then.
We do.
Yeah, I suppose we do.
We also have another president who still thinks he's president. So we have two presidents for the
Two
moment.
for one. Yeah.
The election could be its own episode for 50 to 80 hours to talk about some of the insanity that I have seen and so forth. But I don't want to get into it because it'll just drive me nuts, and it has driven me nuts.
Yeah, we've already done 4 of these on flaws. I think we covered it.
We've covered many of the flaws that I've seen being used recently.
Yeah.
So either way, there was an election, and it was nice to see that there were no riots or, over craziness in the public good thereafter. And I will accept that as, amazingly enough, a rational outcome that far. Now we wait until December and the certification, and then January for the installation of the next president. So
there you go.
Anything else?
No, I'm going to get back to golf coverage. So,
all right. Well, I'm going to go take a break.
Good. So, go teach the kids some new words.
Yes. Stultify. Excellent word.
Nicely
Boring,
done.
mentally draining. That's what this was at times to watch this LSAT. But in the end, it all is worth it because we're able to talk about this with some authority. And that I think that's really helpful for us and for a lot of people.
Another great set of test content. I was really happy with what I saw people have to experience here. Certainly opportunity to improve on the delivery of it. The administration side of this leaves a lot to be desired, but hopefully by January, February, they continue to get things right or start to.
That's right. As far as test delivery, this was a step back, and I think a significant step back, and I'd like to see them correct that. I think they've done a lot of work towards it, and I think unfortunately they were let down by their test proctoring vendor choice here. And on that happy note, as I start to get irritated again.
Sorry.
Hope everybody has a great week. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. If you enjoy it, leave us a comment as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We always appreciate hearing from students. And on behalf of Jon and myself, we hope you enjoyed it. Have a great week. Be safe. We'll talk to you again soon.